We talk quite a lot about concepts like game start, early game, mid game, and the late game. However, we never really clarify on what these terms mean. Like, what is a mid game? What is a definitive start of an end game or a late game? In general, you can approach this in different ways. You can use either timeline or energy usage. However, instead, I would like to approach it in a different way by looking at certain situations and your abilities to define what stage of the game you are in. So today we're going to be looking at the 5 stages of the game. Those are the game start, the early game, which I like to refer to as the 4X stage, the mid game, where we see a dramatic shift from that 4X style to the classic Paradox grand strategy style, the late game, and then finally the end game. So let's take a look at what these are and how to identify them as you're playing. So let's talk about the game start. This is incredibly straightforward. This is the process of making a race, setting up your starter options. What kind of planet are you going to be on? What kind of civics are you going to be taking? And that sort of thing. There is quite a lot of stuff obviously going on underneath the hood with the species creation, and in the end it all boils down to the same thing. You have one planet, a tiny fleet, a construction ship, and a science ship, and you will be mostly focusing on corvettes at the start of the game, as well as getting those initial resources out. So let's talk about the early game, or as I already mentioned, I like to refer to as the 4X stage. So this is when you start to take territory. You find places that you find interesting and put your claim on them. You get your first mining stations out, your first surveying. You get your habitable world survey mission here that you should probably finish because it does give you a decent amount of influence. You will start to get first contact. You will get your first anomalies. You will get your first factions that you need to attend to. You will start leveling your scientists. You have your first traditions, which, from my perspective, most likely will be expansion, especially if you're a new player. You going for expansion is generally a good idea. Discovery, on the other hand, if you want to rush for a tall empire, but of course expansion is useful there as well for the reduction in cost to the outposts. There are really no real wars, because no fleet is really capable of engaging a enemy spaceport at this stage. There is a couple of exceptions to that. The Devouring Swarm, for instance, with their bonuses, or the Fanatic Purifiers, for that matter, will be able to take over these first planets in very early wars. So that's something you want to keep in mind, although this does cripple them slightly due to the amount of population that they will get due to that. Technologically, they will start lagging behind, which is an issue. You will start developing your first relationships with other empires, trade deals, getting energy from them, star charts, research agreements, and that sort of thing. You'll basically, most likely in the first 6 years, start to get your first colonies underway. You will be able to pick your first planet to set a foot on and build your first society, of course, unless you're playing the One Planet Challenge, because then we don't deal with that at all. Generally, in terms of weapon technology, level 1, level 2 tech here, mainly because of the pirate event that starts at the start of the game. You'll get your first shields, you'll get your first armor, and that sort of thing. At the end of this, you will probably be using mostly destroyers, as you'll be having to research all of this. You're having tons of relationships with other empires, mostly with science treaties, maybe with defensive pacts and that sort of thing. And you will probably be finishing up a tradition tree, as well as your first ascension perk, which is pretty exciting. Of course, that is always an interesting one to choose from when it comes to which ones you want to go for. Your fleet power at the end of the early game is probably sitting somewhere around 5,000 fleet power or something like that, so that's something to keep in the back of your head. Then we can move over towards the mid game. What defines the mid game, to me at least? And for me, that is the full-on transition of a 4X style game where you explore, you discover, you exterminate, and that sort of thing, to the full-on grand strategy experience that you get within the context of the game. Basically, as soon as you have your first sector and your empire is becoming so large that you need the AI to handle a lot of this stuff, you really start to get into the grand strategy space. there's too much territory for an average person to handle without constantly trying to pause things and min-maxing stuff. Now, of course, you can still do that, but if you really want to, that's a whole different question. Most importantly on this one is the Empire Capital Complex. The Empire Capital Complex means that you can add an additional civic to your empire. I think that is also an incredibly important step towards that mid-game. You'll start developing your tier 3 weapons, maybe even tier 4 weapons. Your first major wars will happen at this stage, at least from my perspective. You start to solidify your borders, and you will start to get major border friction with empires around you. Unless, of course, they're xenophobic isolationist fallen empires, then they do not look too kindly upon you. Also, things like cleaning up minor neutrals, crystalline entities, drones, pirates, and that sort of thing. Not the endgame pirates, mind you, but basically anything involving of neutrals in your territory that can mess up any of your internal transfers when your ships start to be cleansed here. You may start or join an alliance. That's definitely something that can happen here. Of course, this is completely based on your ethics. You'll most likely start to look into vassals or tributaries. If you're particularly militaristic, this is the sort of thing that is definitely that can happen. So at the end of the mid-game, however, we start to construct habitats, 5,000 minerals each, I think 150 or 200 influence, but still, you're starting looking at large amounts of resources that you can use on larger projects, such as habitat construction. You'll start to destroy or finishing off any of the Guardian quests, if you have Leviathans, that is. You'll probably end up with about 3 Ascension perks or something along those lines, which basically means that you can start looking at some of the biological, technological, or psionic ascensions, which is always really good. And most importantly, this is the moment where a tall empire can take the option to transition into a wide and or flex empire. So basically starting out really tall and then spreading out into the void, so to speak. And at the end of this, you'll probably sit around 40 to 50,000 fleet power, mostly made up out of cruisers. May have a battleship, 1 or 2 of them, and that is pretty much the extension of the mid-game. If you're playing with the Apocalypse update, a Khan most likely has risen up by this point from the Marauders. Then we move on to the late game, the part of the game that everybody always bases their meta around, which I don't necessarily agree on. It does not, just because it's a late game doesn't mean that we should base all of our meta stuff around this. So just because your ships can have all the cool bells and whistles on them doesn't necessarily mean that that is basically what we need to focus on. The late game is most likely going to be one of the longest stretches within the game. So you're going to most likely be starting your first mega structure here. Fallen empires start to wake, but this always depends on your difficulty level. The lower the difficulty level, the later they'll start to wake up. Massive wars versus alliances and individual nations start to pop up. Late game tech such as XL weapon, 0-point power, jump drive start to take shape within the context of the game. Psionic Ascension empires start to get access to the Shroud, mass bioengineering of species. Wars versus Awakened empires definitely start here, and there is a ton of border friction that really messes up relationships between various empires. Either you have a ton of vassals, tributaries that can all be integrated. Of course, if you're playing the One Planet Challenge or a generally tall empire, then you'll just have to keep him in check. And towards the end, the first galactic crisis most likely starts to pick up, like the Scourge, Unbidden, or Contingency, or War in Heaven, depending on if you have the right expansion packs. Now, by the end of the late game, there are multiple massive fleets of 100k flying around. Your first megastructure will be finished up unless, of course, you're going for the One Planet Challenge or a very tall empire. Then you have generally a little bit earlier with the Science Nexus or the Sentry Array. You have tons of resources. You're basically finishing up all planetary development, so maxing out your mines, your energy production, your science production. Late game buildings like the Galactic Stock Exchange and that sort of thing are starting to pop up. Shroud empires can potentially get packed with a entity, such as the Eater of Worlds, and only a few more empires are standing. Like, most of the starter empires have been eliminated or been turned into vassals of larger empires at this stage, and really expect to have something like maybe 5 or 6 real major entities back on the map. If you have played your cards really badly, then the Galactic Crisis has most likely consumed most of the galaxy, or you managed to stop it, so that's definitely something you want to keep in the back of your head. Then we get to the end game, and of course the end game is one of the longest segments within the game, because it lasts as long as you want. Let's put it that way. So you're turning out megastructures like it is Tuesday. You're finishing off most of your tradition trees at this point, at least the ones that apply to you. Several tiers of repeatable tech have been done, most likely on weapon and shielding technology, just to crank up your weapon systems a little bit more. The final wars of the game are starting to happen, basically the last ditch effort for getting enough resources to win the game. 500k, 1 million fleet power is really not outside of the realm of impossibility. The Galactic Crisis has most likely been completely crushed. You'll have so many resources, you literally cannot spend them all. That's how quickly they come in. And the last ones standing in those final wars, as I mentioned, are ready to bash their heads together. And finally, there is winning the game. There you have it. Those are the 5 stages of, at least from my perspective, of the game. The game start, the early game, the mid game, the late game, and the end game. Now, these, of course, are not set in stone. As the game develops, these kind of shift back and forth, new things get added, and hey, maybe for you, they mean slightly different things. Maybe you like to go with timelines. Maybe you like to go with energy and mineral income. This is all on you. This is just my perspective, but you can use that as a guideline, saying, hey, I'm now in the late game. What does this mean? Well, maybe I should go and move in towards this direction. Maybe I should go and get a large amount of resources now, or should I get a large amount of fleets? And that sort of thing. So there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to this sort of thing, and it doesn't really apply to every single situation, so consider this a general overview. We're going to wrap it up here. I hope that you learned something today. I did, whilst doing a full-on research on this, as I did realize a couple of things, which is always good. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take good care of yourselves, and as always, each other.